The pale morning light seeped through the window, casting its gentle glow upon the room. Olya, restless and unable to find solace in sleep, shifted positions once more. The old iron bed emitted a soft creak, eliciting a wrinkle of annoyance on the girl's nose as she let out a heavy sigh. Her mind was consumed by the events that had led her to this moment, replaying them over and over again. "Hey, Sasha, I've passed with flying colors," Olya exclaimed, clutching Sasha's hands with joy as she jumped with uncontained excitement. "It means we can choose the city where we'll be placed. Aren't you thrilled?" To her surprise, Sasha nonchalantly shrugged his shoulders and averted his gaze from her. Immediately, Olya sensed that something was amiss. What could have transpired during their few days apart? Could he be unwell? "Sasha, what's the matter?" Olya inquired with concern. "Why do I have to leave? And what about you? Will you come with me? Please tell me." Sasha let out a sigh, his voice tinged with regret. "Olga, I'm sorry," he murmured, "but it's better if you don't stay in town. In fact, it's for the best. It's Confusion and disbelief filled Olya's eyes. "What's going on, Sasha? Why do I have to leave? And why won't you come with me?" Her voice trembled, on the brink of tears. "You said you loved me. You said we would get married, have 3 beautiful children together. We even talked about names. You can't do this to me." Sasha dismissively waved his hand. "You'll find someone else," he said bluntly. "Goodbye. Lena is waiting for me. We're going to the bridal salon to pick out her wedding gown." And with that, he left, leaving Olya devastated in his wake. And so Olya plopped onto the furthest bench in the park, her sobs echoing until dusk began to settle. When her tears had dried up and her energy had ebbed away, it hit her like a ton of bricks. Sasha was no longer in her heart. That traitor didn't deserve even a tiny corner of her soul. Brushing away her final tears, Olya lifted her chin with newfound resolve and strode confidently back to the dormitory. When it was time to receive the task, Olya instinctively chose a small village. Location no longer mattered to her, as long as she had a place to live and work. After all, medical professionals were respected everywhere, and rural life didn't scare her. She didn't grow up in the city either. As it turned out, the village was quite picturesque. Located next to the forest, almost all the houses were well-maintained. The local farm, as Olya later learned, was famous throughout the district for its prosperity and foresight. So, in a way, she was lucky. However, by her arrival, the medical center had not yet been completely renovated. In particular, the part where Olya will live. The owner of the farm personally apologized to the young doctor and kindly took her in his car to Grandma Tonya. Grandma Tonya kindly agreed to shelter Olga until her apartment is ready. Now, Olya found herself lying on an old iron bed, staring out the window, and pondering whether fate had dealt her a favorable hand or not. This fine morning, the lass had no need to venture to her workplace. Thus, she luxuriated a tad longer in her cozy bed before deciding to lend a hand to Grandma Tonya, who could be heard calmly tinkering away in the kitchen. Afterwards, she yearned for a stroll through the nearby forest. Of course, she had no intention of foraging for mushrooms herself just yet. It still seemed a smidgen daunting. However, she could meander through the village, familiarizing herself with her future environs. Olya arose from her slumber, got dressed, and with a stretch, emerged from her room. She greeted the landlady and offered to whip up some breakfast. Baba Tonya, a sprightly and sharp-witted septuagenarian, aside from her right arm, which had all but lost its functionality due to a motorcycle accident 5 years prior, couldn't be deterred. The doctors could not properly mend her severely fractured arm. It had proven a most intricate case indeed. Nevertheless, she remained undaunted, her effervescent smile rarely waning from her wrinkled countenance, her mischievous gaze seeming ever youthful. Baba Tonya graciously accepted the offer of assistance, guiding Oya to the pantry and delighting in the girl's deftness and speed. "I love watching your hands work," she praised. "It's obvious that you have a kind heart. We were lucky because an experienced doctor treats not only with medicines, but also with kind words as it happened. I should know I worked as a nurse all my life, right up to the accident. I even went to the front line. Here it is." Oya regarded her grandmother with awe and ventured, "Was it quite frightful? I knew many of them by name, as they told stories about their families and children. It made me think even more about their offspring." Grandma Tonya paused, frowning. But after a few moments, she shook her gray head and smiled again, saying, "Vanya is coming now, and we will treat him to a delicious breakfast." Before Oya could ask about this mysterious van, she heard someone enter the house. There was a young man standing in the doorway, about the same age as Oya. There was a certain attractiveness about him, except for the deep sadness in his eyes, which made them seem too serious. He stood in the doorway, silently looking at Olga for a while before turning around and leaving. Unable to contain her curiosity any longer, Oya exclaimed, "Hello!" At that moment, Tomya's grandmother gently waved her hand and shared, "He can't talk, Olenka, and everyone calls him Vanya. He comes here to help me, because I can't do it alone. Besides, he could use some extra money. Unfortunately, he cannot get a normal job, so he generously helps the elderly. He's really a kind-hearted guy." The elderly woman sighed heavily, without taking her eyes off the door. "Was he born like this?" the girl asked. "He seems normal, even pleasant, but there is a note of sullenness in him." "No, initially he was a healthy and strong boy. I knew his parents well. They also had a younger sister. She grew up to be a beautiful young lady. She is now married and moved to the city with her husband. They had led a good life until that fateful day. Their house is located on the outskirts of the village, next to the forest. That's what killed them. When Vanya was only 6 years old, 3 fugitives escaped from their cells. Under the cover of night, they entered their garden. Hearing a knock on the door, Vanya's parents woke up and went to investigate, suspecting nothing wrong. When they opened the door, the criminals attacked them and demanded cash. But what kind of wealth did they own? Nobody. Therefore, the attackers killed them both. They invaded the residence, looting everything in sight. Fortunately, they faced the back room. Hearing about the horror that was happening, Vanya froze, but still managed to drag his younger sister under the bed to keep her safe. When silence fell, he ventured out and found that his parents had been brutally murdered. Vanya's screams were so shrill that the villagers had goosebumps running down their backs, forcing them to flee. They had not seen such cruelty since the war. They had to pull him away from his mother, as he came to her, covered in blood. This sight made Grandma Tonya shudder even at the memory of it. The criminals were arrested quickly, red-handed. But since that terrible day, Vanya has become mute. He's withdrawn into himself. Fortunately, his grandparents intervened. Otherwise, the children would have been condemned to an orphanage, which could mean death for him. As time passed, Vanya gradually came to his senses and got a little used to the company of other people, but still remained silent. Meanwhile, the trio found solace in drinking tea and eating Olya's pancakes. Olya involuntarily stared at Vanya, wondering how such a small boy could endure such horror. Vanya, however, could not meet her gaze, overcome by shyness and embarrassment. After finishing the only pancake, he hurriedly left the kitchen. The following morning, Olya embarked on her first day of work. Anxiety bubbled within her, signaling the start of a fresh chapter in her life. A fully fledged, self-sufficient adulthood. Awaiting her was a role brimming with responsibility. As she grasped the handle of the medical center's entrance, Olya cast a glance backward and spotted Vanya standing at a distance, observing her. A realization dawned upon her. He had been trailing her. She offered him a warm smile and waved, but Vanya averted his gaze, retreating swiftly. That day was Olya's inaugural experience seeing patients solo. Though few in number, they were eager to converse not just about their ailments, but also about Olya herself. Being her first patients, they knew they'd be inundated with questions from neighbors curious about the new doctor, keen for tidbits to share. Olya empathized, responding politely, but deflecting inquiries about her personal life. As Olya prepared to return home, she peered out the window and caught sight of Vanya once more. He stood behind an age-old birch tree, his gaze fixed on the hospital doors. A smile crept onto Olya's face. It seemed she'd acquired a personal guardian angel. Stepping outside, she considered calling to Vanya, but he ducked behind the tree, making his shyness evident. Choosing to play along, Olya acted as though she hadn't seen him and quietly made her way home. All the while, Vanya followed her at a distance. Now they had such a daily routine. Olya was in front, and Vanya was a little behind. They went to the medical center every morning and returned every evening. Olya got so used to it that one day, when Vanya did not come home from work, she panicked, fearing the worst. She rushed home in a panic and found Vanya safe and sound at their house. It turns out that it's all because of Tony's brave grandmother pig. This pig had a special disdain for pig squeals. If someone dared to take a piglet in a sack to the market, and she got wind of it, no door could hold her back. Possessing a sturdy 100-kilogram physique, she fought her way through any locks and jumped over fences, determined to save the kids, strangers or not. The neighbors were well acquainted with her friendly character and usually chose a longer but quiet route to the market. However, on this fateful day, one neighbor sold a piglet to another, and wanting to celebrate the deal, they decided to take a shortcut past Tony's grandmother's house. This adventure did not bring results. As soon as the pig heard the plaintive squeal, she broke into a brand new strong lock. In the blink of an eye, the pig raced across the yard and jumped over the fence. The terrified men dropped the bag and scattered. Strangely enough, both the pig and the men eventually cursed, one driven by maternal instinct and the other by sheer laziness, regretting that they had not chosen a longer route. Fortunately, at that moment, Vanya turned out to be with Tony's grandmother. He pulled the piglet out of the bag and calmed it down. He drove the mother pig back into the barn and returned the piglet to the men, who reappeared as soon as they saw that Vanya had handled the situation. They even offered him a drink as a token of gratitude, but he just shook his head and politely declined. Instead, he immediately returned to fixing the door. Olya caught him while he was at work. As soon as Vanya caught sight of her, breathless and visibly anxious, he rushed over. His eyes wide with alarm as he peered into hers, but she gently touched his arm and, catching her breath, offered with a warm smile. "How about I whip up some pancakes and we enjoy them with tea?" Vanya's face broke into a timid smile, and he nodded in agreement. However, the following day, Vanya observed Olya heading to work from afar. This pattern persisted over the next 3 months. Olya didn't move into the room at the nurse's station. Instead, Baba Tonya convinced her to stay, and Olya gladly accepted. The bond between her and the elderly woman quickly deepened. Vanya was a frequent sight at their place. Olya found herself growing fond of this enigmatic, reticent man, though part of her hesitated to acknowledge these feelings. And then one day, right after the consultations were over, the local postwoman quietly slipped into her office and handed her a telegram. After reading it, Olya quickly ran through the brief message. "It's Dad. Come to the hospital." After seeing off the last of her patients, Olya quickly dressed and went home. Her thoughts were on her father. She remembered how he had expressed his reluctance to let her go so far, worrying about the possibility of an emergency, while she was isolated and out of reach. And now that fear has materialized. As she made her way home, her vision blurred with tears, barely registering the road before her. Out of nowhere, she was sharply jolted from her thoughts, as she was suddenly knocked off her feet and thrown to the ground. An instant later, a fully loaded ZIL truck barreled past, its brakes screeching uselessly. The ground beneath the girl trembled with the growl of the mighty machine. Olya winced from the pain. The landing was rough, and then she heard an alarmed voice ring out. "Are you blind? He was heading straight for you. You could have been flattened." Olya lifted her gaze to see who was chastising her, and was stunned. It was Vanya. The girl whispered, "More, tell me more." Vanya shook Olya by the shoulders, embraced her, then shook her again, all the while shouting, berating her for her recklessness. Yet she smiled and softly echoed, "More, say more." Olya made her way back home. Her father had suffered a heart attack, but he bounced back quickly. Before long, the girl could discreetly return to her village. Now she felt it was hers, for she realized she truly belonged there. Respected, valued, and loved. Soon enough, her parents also came to visit their daughter, coinciding with her wedding.